welcome. You're watching Head to Head with UATV. I'm Oles Gerjuk. The spurious stories about Ukrainians eating a child and fascists seizing power in Kyiv alarmed Ukraine in 2014. Since then, fake has spread like a virus, destroying facts into outlandish fictions despite being attributed only to obscure sources. And it inflamed already divisive politics before the Ukrainian government concluded, perhaps too late, that it was a Russian disinformation campaign. To discuss the issue so we can be more aware of it, joining us in the studio is Vasyl Miroshnychenko. He is partner at CFC Consulting Company. Hello, and thank you for being with us today.
Good morning.
Mr. Miroshnychenko, perhaps in 2014, Russian disinformation campaign had just begun to become visible. But when did it actually start?
Look, disinformation is nothing new for the Kremlin. We have to go back to the Soviet times when basically the Soviet government used disinformation massively. What is new, however, is actually the way it's been applied. Because currently what happens, the reason it works, because Russia is mixing current affairs with entertainment, and actually they make it all very theatrical and very emotional. And this is actually what makes news and the consumption of news very powerful. It has an impact. And the way they do it, as it was any part of disinformation, you take partial truth and then you mix it up with something with something you make up, basically.
With some ideas that you want to
there are some ideas that people basically
about.
Accept, and then they make a twist, and then they have their own interpretation, or they come up with something totally new. However, we have to look at the audiences of the Russian disinformation. They have an internal audience in Russia. They have an audience in the near abroad, as they call it, which includes Ukraine. But also they have the international audience, which basically, and they tailor their messages to each target market. So in Germany, they have a certain narrative, and in Southern Europe, Italy, and Spain, it's different, and of course, it's different from what they do in the US.
What are the most biased sources?
Look, the sources are known, and this is actually the media holding which is owned by the government or through the Gazprom, and these are the media outlets which are there. So there are internally all the basically Russian media outlets, and then there is foreign sort of not counterparts, but like basically the subsidiaries, or let's say the structures which like Russia Today and RT now, and then Raptly in Germany, and then Sputnik, which is actually broadcasting in 60-something languages, and the thing is that they're churning out news at a neck-breaking speed. They're pretty quick. For instance, when I was in Greece the other year, I was very surprised because most of the Greek news are basically copy-pasting stuff from Sputnik, which is, they have a very good Greek version, and they're putting it into their national news. So most of the narrative on Russian aggression in Ukraine, in Greece, is primarily taken from the Russian sources. So they talk about civil war, they talk about, basically the nationalistic Ukrainian government, which is not adhering to the rights of the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, and things like that.
But it seems like all these media sources, they cooperate with each other, and it creates some kind of a machine. Would you explain us how is it functioning? Is it sporadic, or is it pre-planned and run by somebody?
Actually, since the Russian aggression in Ukraine, we've started talking about a hybrid warfare. It's not something new. Again, it's been around as well in the past. However, what do we mean when we say hybrid warfare? We actually talk about the coordinated efforts of different government agencies, and it includes the military side of that, intelligence, information, as well as economic or diplomatic channels, which are also used to put pressure on a country or actually to deal with a certain issue. So when we talk about hybrid warfare, this is a coordinated, very highly skilled, coordinated effort pursuing a certain goal. And apparently, communication aspect of that is very important. So, but we have to look at it actually in the context. So it's not on its own. It actually the way it's done, in coordination. Nevertheless, the communication part of that is the most visible part, and this is what we see, through the way messages are spread, the way disinformation or deception is done, and the way they spread those news. Basically, they continually come up with certain themes or certain topics that they want to promote. And like, for instance, recently when Ukraine got a visa-free regime for the Schengen countries in June of this year, Russian media, as well as all its foreign outlets, have been talking about the fact that this is not real, that the visa-free regime is not real. Ukrainians will have to come up with lots of documents when they cross the border, and they're not getting what they're getting. And they try to fool everybody, especially, by the way, they were targeting their own population. Nevertheless, it's too difficult to maintain the level of that, because once people start talking to each other, they now realize Ukrainians no longer need to be standing in lines to get the Schengen visa. They can now easily travel with their biometric passport, and Russians cannot do it, and people living in Crimea cannot do it. So a lot of people in Crimea, they actually, went to Kherson, got their Ukrainian passports, and now they can travel visa-free to Europe. Or, for instance, over this recent campaign, which was related to North Korea, where there was actually an allegation that the rockets originated from Dnipropetrovsk, from Dnipro, basically from Ukraine somehow. And there was a whole campaign launched. Different media outlets in the US and others started publishing some stories about that, actually alleging that Ukraine could have been involved. And you have to keep in mind that that was done at the time when the White House was considering granting little defensive weapons to Ukraine. So in a way, it was delayed, and we only got it very recently. But when it was widely discussed in September, that issue was promoted by the Russian media.
Mm-hmm. But could you give us a list of some more of glaring instances of disinformation about Ukraine?
Look, I mean, they're all there. I mean, they're happening on the regular basis. And for instance, what Russia is doing, I mean, they are interpreting history differently, and they use history as a tool to explain certain developments which are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And
as arguments.
Yeah, as arguments, and basically, and you probably, I mean, the 2014, I mean, they were using this World War II narrative, basically, talking about the fascist Nazi junta. I mean, they evolve, so they no longer talk about it. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, they continue interpreting history differently, and they use different instances of explaining certain things. But the problem with Russia is the following. Basically, to paraphrase Golda Meir, it's Russians, or the Kremlin, refuses to recognize Ukraine as a nation. So for us, Ukrainians, there is very little compromise, basically. We just have to fight back. Because if we take the premise that they don't recognize us as a nation, it means we don't exist for them. So they treat us at their internal territory or something, which actually does not leave much space for any negotiations, right? Mm-hmm. So this is actually the major challenge of dealing with the dictator Putin. And
in your opinion, how could we counteract this policy?
Oh, it's very easy, I think. We have to be strong. We have to be strong militarily. We have to have very capable military forces to be able to fight back. We have to be strong, basically, in terms of our economy. We have to curb corruption in Ukraine. We have to start growing. Our economy has to start growing. We have to attract foreign direct investment. We have to promote exports from Ukraine. We have to actually bring more tourists to the country. So basically, we have to make Ukraine a robust, strong, developing, I mean, not developing, but a developed nation, right? Which is aspiring to join the EU. And that aspiration to join the EU should serve as an engine of those reforms.
Mm-hmm. But in your opinion, how could we battle the disinformation about Ukraine?
Battling the disinformation is in the, this is a topic which is always discussed, how to deal with that, right? But the thing is that you just basically have to talk the truth. And you basically have to amplify your voice and make sure that your stakeholders understand what's going on. Because at the end of the day, those analysts and those journalists who are covering Ukraine and Russia, initially they were a little bit confused because they didn't know what's going on. But once they delved deeper, they understood what's going on, right? So therefore, all Ukraine has to do, Ukraine has to basically keep on communicating with the international audiences, go out to different capitals in Berlin, in Paris, in London, and keep on talking to the politicians, keep on talking to the journalists, bring more press tours and actually organize press tours of foreign journalists to Ukraine, engage with journalists in different other places, and we have to talk to them. We have to communicate continuously.
And the very last question: after 3 years of the conflict and aggressive disinformation, how would you evaluate the readiness of Ukrainian population to recognize the fake news and not to read the fake news?
Look, media literacy is not an issue for Ukraine only. There is very lack of media literacy in pretty much in any country. and we need to educate our population, as well as American, basically, government has to educate their own population.
Yeah, but are Ukrainians ready for this already?
But look, I would say that the understanding of the issue has substantially improved. But nevertheless, in the era of social media, it's very difficult to filter out information. People they trust what they read, but they don't actually pay too much attention where the story is coming from and what media resource has published the story. So it's important that we promote media literacy and actually communicate to the general public. But as well, we need to do lots of work with the journalists, especially with the journalists in the rural areas, as well as in the Ukrainian regions, in the smaller cities, which they seem to be more affected and more influenced by the Russian disinformation, especially when we talk of eastern and southern Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for right now. But thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
That was Vasyl Miroshnychenko, partner at CFC Consulting Company. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Goodbye.